You're tuned to Nobidad TV.
We're talking about race in the media at a time when we really need to be talking about race in the media, given what's going on out there. You know, starting with Ferguson, Staten Island, Cleveland. Wesley reminded me of like dozens of others out there. Those are the ones that are getting the big media attention now. We do have a problem out there. Carol Simpson, the first African-American woman to anchor a major network newscast. That's a pretty big deal. And also, she became the first woman or minority to be a sole moderator of a presidential debate. So she knows some stuff. She's also a professor at Emerson College, and she is a self-pronounced news junkie.
I marvel at the demonstrators who have been marching in the streets of American cities these past few nights. In the cold, in the sleet, in the rain. During the summer, I remember talking with some other folks about the demonstrations, and we were laughing that, you know, when it got cold in St. Louis, we wouldn't see any more protests. But nothing has stopped the protests from continuing and from growing across the country. I'm tired. As Chris Rock said, I'm tired. I'm tired of being tired. I have been covering, shall we call them, urban uprisings since 1965. I marched with Dr. King in Chicago, where he was fighting for fair housing in the most segregated city in the nation at the time. I can't tell you how many riots I covered, sparked by a black kid being shot in the back by a white policeman. I covered cases like police brutality in Houston, Texas, which at the time was considered the most brutal police force in America. So here we are in 2014, and the names are now familiar. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice. And don't you know, I wake up this morning and read about Akai Gurley. Am I saying it right, Wesley?
Yes.
It's Akai Gurley. I didn't know about him. He's a black man who was shot walking with his girlfriend in a stairwell in a Brooklyn apartment building. And he was shot by white police. He was unarmed, and he was killed. And they were announcing today that even though that death occurred November 20th, they were going to convene a grand jury to investigate what happened. Gee, isn't it interesting how other things will make these other things happen? We are going to begin tonight with our keynote speaker, Wesley Lowery. He is a political reporter for the Washington Post. He has reported on stories on media and housing and business and diversity and Metro News, and his reporting has been published in some of the great publications and newspapers that we have. The Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. Wesley, I first came to know you on TV when I saw him having been arrested in McDonald's in Ferguson, and I'm like, how does somebody get arrested in McDonald's? He's in there with Big Macs and Happy Meals and chicken nuggets and gets arrested. And I was laughing at you. I'm sorry to say, I was laughing, but I know it wasn't funny down there. But 1,000 miles away, I could laugh at your plight. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Wesley Lowery.
I just got back from Ferguson earlier this week, where I've been since the very early days after Michael Brown was killed. So he was killed on August 9th, and I arrived on the 11th. And I've basically lived in St. Louis since then. with a few short trips back to DC to pay my rent and do some laundry. But otherwise, it's been all Ferguson. And so, I think that, the question, the theme, the topic today is, does race matter to the media? And I think we know that answer. It should. Does it? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But should it? It certainly should, because what we see is that through so many of the biggest stories of the year, of the month, of the week, of the decade, certainly of the Obama presidency, so many of the biggest stories in the country, race belies all of them. There are issues, race is in the United States of America one of the biggest and pervasive social issues. It's something that affects all of our lives intimately, and yet it's one of the things that we're least capable of discussing civilly. It's one of the things that often we're least capable or at least comfortable talking about. And so it's really interesting. And so the question becomes, why does something like Michael Brown being shot and killed by a police officer, why does that become an issue of race? Why do we end up discussing race through that? And I think that for those of us with a little pigment in our skins, it's easy to understand why. We can't always explain it exactly, but we know why we think why this is a racial issue. But so many of our brothers and sisters who are white Americans often ask that question. Why is this about race? What's going on here? Which is why the media coverage of issues like this is so important, because it's through media coverage that we tell this story and have these conversations. I arrived on August 11th, 2 days after Michael Brown had been killed, and I remember actually I was, one of the reasons, anytime a story like this blows up and goes national, a story that is arguably local that becomes national, I always, being a curious journalist, like to try to trace back how that happened. Who were the reporters on the ground? What was the big moment that blew up? And one of the things that was really interesting for me in the Michael Brown story was it was a lot of reporters and people who I consider friends who were intimately involved from the very beginning. On August 9th, when Michael Brown was shot and killed by Darren Wilson on Canfield Drive in Ferguson, a local news reporter, a woman named Brittany Noble, gets a phone call. Brittany's an old friend of mine. We've gone to NABJ for years together. She was at her engagement photo shoot. She was set to get married at the end of August, early September in St. Louis. She lives in Ferguson. She got a call from a source. There was this police shooting across town in Ferguson. Things are getting a little heated there. You might want to swing by. So Brittany, being a dogged reporter, leaves her engagement photo shoot on her day off and drives to Canfield Drive as the first reporter on the scene, and sees, because frankly most of the local media that day, some kid got shot. We got the Cardinals are in the playoffs right now, or we're getting close to the postseason. We got other stuff going on. Brittany shows up and she gets what ends up becoming some of the most compelling video that went across social media that night, this Instagram video of the mother at the scene sobbing. And these police dogs barking at the mother of the dead boy. The stepfather of the boy holding this cardboard sign he's made that says, "The police just executed my son," in the street. And I'm sitting, at the time I was in Michigan, I was covering the Senate primaries as a midterm trip, because I cover Congress normally. And I was in Michigan, and my social media, since Brittany and I are friends, I'm seeing it on Facebook, I'm seeing it on Instagram, I'm seeing it on Twitter, I'm seeing a lot of tweets, and so I said, "Hey, everyone, follow my friend Brittany if you're paying attention to this Michael Brown thing." And I said, "Okay, good for her. She's doing really good coverage of this. Wonder if that'll ever make it out of St. Louis." So the next day, Sunday, protests start in St. Louis. You start to see some demonstrations, some marches. People start taking to the streets. And I started seeing tweets from a friend of mine, Matt Pierce, the LA Times, a white reporter, but who's from Kansas City. So when this happened, he drove over. And I'm seeing tweets from him about, I think they just lit the Quick Trip on fire. I think police are coming in, this is getting violent. And I'm looking and I'm saying, okay, maybe this is day two. And I'm thinking, maybe this is getting national, this is getting big. And so that night I followed Matt as I was on the plane back to DC. I followed it all night and I said, all right, first thing in the morning, I gotta try to do something. So I got in and I started calling the congressional delegation, because it's my job, I do politics, calling Claire McCaskill, I'm calling Roy Blunt, and the local congressman, Emmanuel Cleaver, and Lacey Clay. Hey, you're gonna call for a federal investigation, what's gonna happen? There was this violence overnight, and one of my editors said, well, would you go? And it was one of those moments where, as a reporter who's really interested in politics and race and society and the confluence of those things, oftentimes the best stories are the ones that come when you really don't want to do them. So I still hadn't unpacked from my Michigan trip. I still had the exact same bag packed, in my living room. And I really, really didn't want to travel anymore. But I said, yeah, I'll go to Missouri for 2 days. Why not? I'll get on a plane. Like, all right, can you go today? Can you go right now? So I got on a plane 2 hours later and was in Missouri by the afternoon. And I get on the ground for a press conference with the family, screaming, the first time they'd appeared publicly. And then I moved on to, and it was very dramatic. We could tell that this was going to be something. They just hired Ben Crump, who was the Trayvon Martin family attorney. I was hearing whispers that Al Sharpton was going to be coming on the next day, and I talked to him as I got off the plane. And we kind of knew this was going to start having some legs, but I still, at this point, am thinking, this is going to be a one-day story, a two-day story. I'm going to drop in, file something really quick, and then work on a feature for 3 days, and we'll have some really good weekend piece, and then I'll go back to covering politics in D.C. But after the press conference, I went to, and local NAACP was holding a forum. And for those of us who, very often, we cover these types of things, and I've covered a ton of community meetings, a ton of forums. Very often it's 20 people, it's 30 people, it's the same 20 and 30 people who are really interested or really upset. But I get to this church, and I see at least 100 people in the parking lot. And I'm like, maybe they just haven't opened the doors yet, what's going on? So I push my way through them, I walk inside, and I walk up. This church has a second floor sanctuary. I get up there, and it's filled to capacity. It maybe seats 300 people comfortably, and there are 400 in there. There are people in the hallways, lining the hallways, and over 100 people who are waiting in the parking lot to hear about what had happened after the meeting would be over. And that was the moment when I realized that this wasn't about Michael Brown, even though this is day 2. That this was a community that was fed up. This was a community that was ready to push back on forces, whether it be law enforcement or whether it be local government, that they had felt had been oppressive to them for decades. Anytime you walk to a forum and there are 200 extra people there, the community is upset. And so as I get out of this forum, I meet up with these young activists there. And at this point, they're not young activists. They're some kids, some 20-year-olds who live in the area who've been talking a lot on Twitter. They're not activists yet. And so I find them, because I talk a lot on Twitter. And so I find them, and I'm like, all right, take me to where this happened. Take me where there was the violence last night. Let's drive. They hop in my car, and they direct me, and we get back to Ferguson, to Canfield, where Michael Brown had been killed. And as we get there, we see this line of young people screaming at someone. We can't see who they're screaming at. They're on the street. And so we get to the corner, and we turn, and we see these large police tactical vehicles. We see the officers in full riot gear, and they're having this standoff. The officers had come to break up this protest. The young people refused to leave. And you can only liken it to like an old war standoff. One side on here and the other side here, and they're facing each other. And as I walk up to the line of young people, I stop to see this homeowner sitting in the corner in his house. And I go, hey, what's going on, man? Why are you out here? And he goes, well, last night during the little bit of the rioting, they broke one of my car windows. So I'm going to stay out here, and my family's inside. I want to make sure everyone's safe. And as we talk, we start hearing this sound. It sounds like projectiles. We don't know what's going on. And then a tear gas canister lands next to us. So this guy grabs me, and we jump behind a bush. Literally jump behind a bush, and we get tear gas in his front yard. And that started what was an all-nighter of coverage, standing in this suburban subdivision, for lack of a better descriptor, as residents had tear gas shot at them as they stood on their front lawns, as they tried to throw the gas back at officers, as rocks were thrown from both ends, and as officers holding large weapons threatened these young people that they didn't leave, that they could get shot. And it was that moment where I knew that this was something much bigger than Michael Brown. It was something much bigger than this conflict, and that this was something that was going to have real legs. I stayed up all night, was doing interviews, watching young people who had been tear gassed, crying, pouring milk and water in their eyes, trying to get it out. Many of the people were physically blocked from going home. When you line up like that, if anyone who lives behind where the police are lined up, they're told to go home, they can't. And that was there was a geographic issue very often during these protests, was that many of the streets where most of the residents lived would end up being behind where the police had lined up. And so they were being told to disperse, and they physically couldn't. And so I stayed out until 4 or 5 that morning, and I pulled off to I called Brittany, my good friend, because she was like, I'm seeing your tweets. Where are you? What's going on? Are you here? Are you safe? She's come to my place, stay with me and my fiance, come stay. And I was like, all right, I'm on my way, but I gotta file something first. So I pull off at this gas station, and I start typing on my phone. This first article I write from Ferguson, and the lead of that article was something along the lines of, for the third consecutive night, the people of Ferguson, a typically sleepy suburb just north of St. Louis, clashed with those sworn to protect them. On Saturday night, Michael Brown was shot and killed by an officer. On Sunday night, an angry crowd set fire to a gas station believed to be involved in that shooting. But on Monday night, the officers fired back with tear gas and rubber bullets. And that set off what ended up being 3 months of harsh clashes that were the boiling over of decades of tension. What we now know about Ferguson, Missouri and St. Louis is that the county government essentially runs off of giving speeding tickets, poor taxes. That you have all of these municipal governments, these small towns that have large police forces. You have towns of 100 people with 50 police officers. Ferguson, Missouri has 20,000 people, but 30,000 outstanding warrants last year. And what that shows is how broken some of these systems are. And what happens and what we saw in terms of the violence in the streets, I believe, is very largely linked to a group of people who for years have been kept from advancing societally and economically, in part, they believe, because of oppressive forces of government. Ferguson, I've probably written 50 stories from Ferguson and from St. Louis. Historical stories, current stories, live coverage like that night, deep dive profiles. But one of the things has maintained, and I remember, one of the things that's maintained is that the people of Ferguson, the black people of Ferguson, truly believe they're disregarded by their government, and they truly believe they're being oppressed. As I stood the night of the grand jury decision on South Florissant Boulevard across the street from the police station, I stood next to 2 young black men, probably 22, 23, with bandanas over their faces, not wearing shirts, picking up bricks, getting ready to throw them at the police department. Backpacks full of things that I'm sure were probably used to light fires. And I turned to them and I said, so what do you guys think of what's going on tonight? Why are you throwing the bricks? And you don't typically go into an impromptu interview with an arsonist or a looter and expect prose from them. But these 2 young men look at me and they said, back in the day here in Missouri, they used to consider us 3/5 of a man. And they still do. And that's what this decision showed us today. And that's what I would bring forward as one of my biggest takeaways from my time in Missouri, is that for better or for worse when it comes to the violence, for better or for worse when it comes to the looting or the arson, for better or for worse when it comes to the deep distrust in that community, it's much more, any media coverage that paints it as just this emotional reaction, as just this kids being kids, or just this, what's wrong with those people, these animals, what are they doing, is missing the deep structural issues here and the deep pain and deep hurt felt by so many of these people. And I think that the first step to having the conversation we're going to have today, and the continued conversation, the perpetual conversation on race we're having as a nation right now, is to understand that deep pain and that deep history felt in a lot of these communities. I really do believe that, like I said, topics of race are something that none of us are qualified to talk about, but that we're all qualified to talk about. It's one of the most deeply permeating issues in the United States of America in each one of our lives. And so anytime we can have a productive talk about it, I think it's a step in the right direction. So thanks again for having me, everybody.